Getting bigger by being better.
The number one choice for Bristol.
This is BCFM
93.2.
Now, this week we've heard from Europol, the European Union, today, talking to Interior Ministers and the Home Secretary from Britain, and also the new boss of MI6, Alex Younger, all about the possibility of a new wave of terror attacks across Britain and Europe, Martin, organised from Syria.
Well, yes, booga booga. Be afraid, be very afraid. If we were talking about Syria in the first hour, the evidence is overwhelming that the Turkish intelligence services, the other NATO intelligence services, including MI6, and their allies in Saudi Arabia and Qatar, have been definitely involved in supporting jihadi terrorism inside Syria. Michael Flynn, who's the new head of defence intelligence in the US, leaked the DIA report when he was the head of the DIA, saying that ISIS was deliberately created by the US regime.
Yeah, he said it was a willful decision.
Willful decision. So all the evidence suggests that these ISIS terrorists and other terrorists like the Al-Nusra Front operating in Aleppo, they've been armed and trained and directed by NATO intelligence services. And at the same time, these same intelligence services are saying we've got to be afraid, very afraid, of Islamist terrorism. I think we've got to ask the obvious question: who are the terrorists?
So go on, answer your own question.
The NATO intelligence services who've been orchestrating and running jihadi terrorism since Operation Cyclone in the 1980s. I'm quite sure that is the conclusion of the Russian General Staff.
OK, so what about this whole idea of Gladio B? We heard from Sibel Edmonds a few weeks ago a bit about that, and we'll be hearing more in a minute. But she was saying that Gladio B was done after the first Gladio, which was really about opposing the Soviet Union in Europe and having fascists run by NATO doing bomb attacks across Europe, mainly in Italy, but also in countries like Belgium and Germany. And then they would immediately blame those on these Russian-backed groups and Soviet Union-connected groups in Gladio A. Gladio B, a little bit different. Once there was the fall of the Soviet Union, then we saw the rise of this Islamic terrorism, starting really with Afghanistan. And Gladio B was about taking fascists and actually making it look like they were Islamic terrorists and that they were inspired by Islamic countries and by Islamic leaders.
Well, Sibel Edmonds is originally of Turkish origin, and she was a translator from Turkish for the FBI, and that's how she got access to lots of inside information. And of course, in Turkey itself, Gladio was called Ergonokon, and it was related to, and it was a similar setup. But of course, within Turkey, the far right are Islamists. Yeah, so there's not really much of a distinction to be made. You've got secular far rightists and Islamist far rightists. And the point about all of these Gladio operations is that all terrorism, left and right, is orchestrated by the intelligence services, MIT in the case of Turkey. And therefore you have a so-called left-wing bomb which targets the right wing, and a right-wing bomb that targets the left wing. The Islamists then target... and of course, behind all of this is basically the intelligence services who are trying to gain more power for themselves in terms of running the country and so on. So we see this is a classic situation now where the failed Islamist insurgency in Syria, because it looks as if it is going to fail, because the Syrian army and the Russians and their other allies are looking like pretty convincing winners at this stage. They're now going to reorient those people to Europe to create hell and disorder so that they can ask for more powers to do more of the same. Now, at what point do people ask the question, we've been supporting Islamist terrorism against the Russians and others from the 1980s onwards, and then you could argue that this is just blowback, we shouldn't have done that, then these crazy people come and attack us. But in actual fact, I would put it stronger than that. I think virtually all of this terrorism is still being orchestrated from within the Western intelligence services.
Now, we're going to be hearing, this week, actually, I was quite surprised to see Europol on Monday be quite so adamant that we were going to be seeing car bombs going across Europe. Some sort of intelligence they've got that ISIS has decided that car bombs are the new thing. Obviously, Al-Qaeda's out of the window. We've got this rebranded thing called ISIS, and that car bombs are going to start exploding here in Britain and in other places right across Europe.
Well, if you are, in fact, orchestrating those car bombings, then it's a pretty easy call to make, isn't it? It's a very sinister thing for them to say. I mean, the local police in south of France raided what they thought was an ISIS cell operating from an address, and it turned out that they were all working for the intelligence services, supposedly, on some training exercise. Now, at what point, people in Turkey, whether they're of Kurdish extraction or mainstream Turkish-speaking people, are very well aware that that's the sort of thing that intelligence services do. When the bomb attacked the Kurdish peace rally, over a year ago now, and 100 people were killed, people immediately, and ISIS claimed it, the Kurds involved immediately pointed the finger at the regime, because that's the kind of thing they do. And Turkey is part of NATO. Their chaps are all trained at Sandhurst. They work closely with MI6. In Britain, we've got this idea that, but surely we wouldn't do stuff like that. In Turkey, people are much more realistic.
Well, Sibel Edmonds is a whistleblower from the FBI. She's Turkish. She was a translator, but very much an insider working in counter-terrorism in the United States and obviously in Turkey too. Did a bit of work in Turkey. And then she decided she'd had enough of it because she'd seen that the FBI was actually being used, as you were saying in the first hour, Martin, to entrap people and also to actually conduct terrorist attacks itself through this Gladio network. And she was on the Global Research News Hour recently and talked about Gladio, what she calls Gladio B, but she also talks about what Gladio A was. So we've got Gladio A, which was in the 1970s mainly, where the finger was being pointed at the blame for terrorist attacks in Europe was being put onto the Soviet Union, and then Gladio B, where again it was in a similar way, but against the Islamist group. So let's hear from Sibel Edmonds now.
Operation Gladio is not some kind of a conspiracy term or something that people come up with saying, I believe there was such an operation. Operation Gladio, people can go and do a Google search and they can find it even from the CIA's own division. Right. FOIA documents that in late 1950s, after World War II, after CIA was established, after NATO was established, NATO together with the CIA, they created this paramilitary units, covert paramilitary units around the world, mainly in Europe, some in the Middle East, to counter the Soviet Union and the spread of communism as an ideology. So the role of this paramilitary units, funded, directed, managed, armed by the CIA and NATO was during these years in Europe and elsewhere, were to create terror events, blow up bombs, gun down people, set, let's say, a shopping center on fire, and then blame it on the communist networks. And they did hundreds of such operations. There are several good books from historians who have documented these false flag terror events, terror that were created, implemented, brought about by the CIA, NATO's paramilitary units within Eastern Europe, in Italy. And in Italy, they were very big, but the biggest nation that they had, the biggest unit, which had its own also office inside the Pentagon, was in Turkey, and that's where I'm from, the Turkish arm of the Gladio network. So they did all this, and you think that once the Soviet Union dissolved in 1990, 1991, the operation would have been basically shut down because this was against communism, so-called. That's basically the competition between the two superpowers. Not per se the communism as ideology. It was the fight for the dominance, global dominance. But they didn't shut it down. They switched that and they changed the operation from the original operation to Operation B, Gladio Operation B. This time, starting in 1995, 1996, And these are, again, paramilitary CIA, NATO, joint CIA, NATO units in Central Asia, in Caucasus, in Middle East, and in North Africa, utilizing these paramilitary units under fanatic Islam labels and titles and terror organization names, and have them basically create terror events, again, in that part of the world. For example, they have, and this is Gladio Operation B, they have a Chechen network, Chechens, and they have had these units trained inside Turkey, and this is mid-1990s, and it still continues to date. And they arm them, and they set up operational guidelines with targets to, let's say, blow up a school or a movie theater is somewhere in Russia, whether it's in Moscow or in St. Petersburg or elsewhere, or let's say somewhere in Georgia or in Azerbaijan. Same thing with what you see in other parts of the Middle East. So that Operation Gladio turned into a different operation, the same modus operandi of creating false flag events, synthetically created terror units as Islamic fanatic units that would create these terror events, thus the chaos associated with it, thus the justification for NATO, CIA, U.S. military intervention in Middle East today, but with the goal of having more of these events taking us further into the previously Russian territories. And if you look at the ultimate nations that we will be seeing more and more, we have been seeing it with Middle East, but we will be seeing more and more, it would be in places such as Georgia, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Azerbaijan, and basically closing further and further towards Russia, because when they do create these events as consequences, it provides the pretext, the justification to interfere and go inside those nations. For example, Azerbaijan is now becoming a NATO member. We have a large base in Azerbaijan, and anybody who would go and look at the map, you see how close it is, to Russia. Or when you're looking at places like Georgia, for example, and Georgia is another candidate for NATO base to become a NATO member. So that is pretty much in a nutshell of what Operation Gladio is, and the fiction deals with that. And when I talked about my work with the FBI with this particular special unit under counterintelligence, when I said the files dated back to 1997, well, these files specifically dealt with Operation Gladio B with both Turkish individuals and networks and organizations as actors, target actors, but also with really brand names, U.S. agencies and U.S. individuals, prominent names within the State Department, U.S. State Department in late 1990s and early 2000s, and the CIA, and also within Pentagon.
Now that's Sibel Edmonds, FBI whistleblower there. But Martin, she's talking about places like Azerbaijan, the Caucasus, these places, Georgia, for example. We hardly hear anything about these places, and yet at the same time we're being told by our mainstream media that Russia is a threat. Actually, it looks as if we have been using effectively these stay-behind units in many of these countries around Russia to destabilise them and drive them in towards NATO, effectively.
Yes, and of course Turkey plays a particularly important role in this, because you've got Turkic-speaking people spread right across Central Asia and into China in the Xinjiang province. And so, for example, the Thai police believe that the bombing of the Hindu temple that took place in Bangkok some time ago was carried out by terrorists from China of Turkic-speaking origin, manipulated by the Turkish intelligence services, who are an integral part of NATO. So you've got to see this as NATO's standard operating procedure. They've been doing it for years. They set up terrorist organisations which they directly control, like the Grey Wolves in Turkey, who are sort of right-wing terrorist paramilitary. And they also set up or infiltrate existing Islamist or left-wing groups, and then they use their activities in order to justify further repression by the state, surveillance, military intervention. So Turkey, for example, justified its intervention in Syria recently by saying they were going after ISIS, although Erdogan blurted the truth out last week, when he said, well, the only reason we went in was to get rid of Assad, although the Russians then phoned him up and he had to backtrack. But we all know that that's how it works. In Turkey, where tens of thousands of people have died in the dirty war in Turkish Kurdistan, people are very, very well aware that the NATO intelligence services are terrorists. And we've got to get that through people's heads. Well, MI6 is not a Boy Scout organisation.
Well, yes, right. Erdogan has just literally, within the last few weeks, been much more open about the fact that it looks like Turkish troops want to be in Syria to stay. Quite whether they will be or not is another question. And Syria came up this week, as you may have noticed, with Theresa May giving Boris Johnson a bit of a ticking off for talking about the Saudi Arabians particularly, and also, of course, you mentioned Iran, doing these proxy wars in the Middle East, and he got a real slapping down for it. But actually, this is what we've been saying for years.
Indeed, and in actual fact, it's common knowledge, so in a sense, Johnson was only saying what everybody knows.
Interesting.
But of course, as British Foreign Secretary, he ought to have kept his mouth shut, because we're involved as well.
Well, maybe. Interesting, yeah. So, yeah, it's also interesting to see who slapped him down. One of the main people was Malcolm Rifkind, who was on the news, who's obviously, he's one of, well, I say obviously, but he's one of these people that takes money from the arms industry, former chairman of the Intelligence and Security Committee, really extremely dodgy character. Then also Downing Street itself. But it looks like the Foreign Office and many of Boris Johnson's supporters in the Conservative Party are saying, well, hang on a minute, look, he's just saying what the whole of the rest of the world knows, and apparently that's not allowed. But anyhow, let's have a listen to see exactly what Boris Johnson really did say today. So I've got the whole clip, which is a couple of minutes, and he finishes off talking about the puppets and the proxy wars.
There are politicians who are twisting and abusing religion and different strains of the same religion in order to further their own political objectives. And that's one of the biggest problems in the whole, political problems in the whole region. And the tragedy for me, and that's why you have these proxy wars being fought the whole time in that area, is that there's not strong enough leadership in the countries themselves. There are not enough big characters.
Yes.
There are not enough big characters, big people, men or women, who are willing to reach out beyond their Sunni or Shia or whatever group to the other side and bring people together and to develop a national story again. A national story. That's what's lacking. And that's the tragedy. And I've just come from Cyprus, where I've seen one example of how this can happen. And it's not there yet, and it's still very difficult. But you've got two leaders from the Greek community and the Turkish community who are trying, and they're taking risks. They're taking risks, each is taking risks with his own community to try to bring that island together. And I see that in Cyprus, and I have to tell you, I don't see it anywhere else in the region. And that's why you've got international, you've got the Saudis, the Iran, everybody moving in and puppeteering and playing proxy wars. And it's a tragedy to watch it. We need to have some way of encouraging visionary leadership in that area. People who can tell a story that brings people together from different factions and different religious groups into one nation.
Well, the Saudis puppeteering, Martin. What about the Brits and the Americans?
Well, indeed, and when he was mentioning big characters that can bring together different communities, do you know what was popping into my mind? Bashar al-Assad, who's an Alawite with a largely Sunni army crushing Sunni terrorists backed by MI6 and the CIA and Saudi Arabia.
And of course he's treading in hot water here because, of course, as we know, the former French Foreign Minister Roland Dumas actually said that 2 years before the Arab Spring, that is actually during the Labour government, the pre-coalition government, that he was approached by British officials in London who asked him to join with them in starting some kind of armed uprising within Syria.
Indeed, I mention it week after week. and I believe we have a clip of it. Is
We
that
do,
correct?
and for those of you that speak a bit of, I mean, you don't need to speak loads of French, like Angleterre is England, 2 years is I don't know exactly what it is, but anyway, let's have a listen now. It's only about half a minute, but here he is in French saying effectively...
This was on French TV.
Yeah, on French television saying effectively, look, the British said to me, let's go and start an armed uprising in Syria. Roland Dumas, former French foreign minister here.
J'étais il y a 2 ans à peu près, avant que les hostilités commencent en Syrie. Je me trouvais en Angleterre par hasard pour d'autres choses, pas du tout de la Syrie. J'ai rencontré des responsables anglais. Et quelques-uns qui sont mes amis m'ont avoué, en me sollicitant, qu'il se préparait quelque chose en Syrie. C'était en Angleterre et pas en Amérique. L'Angleterre préparait l'invasion des rebelles en Syrie. Et on m'a même demandé à moi, sous le prétexte que j'étais ancien ministre des Affaires étrangères, si je participerais comme ça. J'ai évidemment dit le contraire. J'ai dit, moi, je suis français, ça ne m'intéresse pas. Mais c'est pour dire que cette opération vient de très loin. Elle a été préparée, conçue, organisée.
So that's Roland Dumas, French Foreign Minister, speaking in French there, mercifully short, but I mean, it's pretty obvious what he's saying, isn't it?
Yeah, that was, when was that? It was about 2013, wasn't it? And of course he was talking about before 2011. And he's a conservative French foreign minister. He was Sarkozy's foreign minister. So we have it from the horse's mouth that the uprising in Syria was planned in advance. And if you look at how quickly it turned from what was supposedly peaceful demonstrations into an armed fight, with people armed to the teeth and already carrying out pretty sophisticated
operations. Well, we know also
operations.
that British special forces have been in
Indeed,
Syria. We spoke to people at the time, didn't we?
So in other words, what may happen now is that if the Syrian regime manages to re-establish control over their territory and the full investigation is carried out, and we have to apportion blame for the miserable conditions in the country and the many dead and wounded, that people in Britain will have to go and stand trial at The Hague.
So do you think anyone's told Alex Younger, the new Director General of MI6, that this is what Britain's foreign intelligence services have been doing in Syria?
I'm sure he knows. But don't forget, the trade of spies is deception.
That's true. Anyway, let's have a listen now to what he had to say. His first emergence onto the scene. It's taking over as the boss of Britain's Foreign Intelligence Services, Secret Intelligence Service, MI6. Let's have a listen now to Alex Younger.
As I speak, the highly organised external attack planning structures within Daesh, even as they face military threat, are plotting ways to project violence against the UK and our allies without ever having to leave Syria. In Aleppo, Russia and the Syria regime seek to make a desert and call it peace. The human tragedy is heartbreaking. We cannot be safe from the threats that emanate from that land unless the civil war is brought to an end.
Yes, brought to an end by the defeat of the MI6-backed terrorists. I was on Russia Today last night talking about what's happening in Aleppo, and I was mentioning the White Helmets. The White Helmets were set up by former British Army officer James Le Mesurier. They're funded to the tune of millions of pounds, hundreds of millions of pounds, mainly by Western countries, including Britain. And what they do is they are basically a propaganda arm for Al-Qaeda based in Aleppo. And of course, we're not just running their propaganda, we've also supplied them with anti-tank weaponry and with anti-aircraft weaponry, as we have been doing since the 1980s.
Hang on. He's saying, this is Alex Younger, this new MI6 boss, is saying that Russia and Assad are creating a whole new generation of terrorists who are coming on planes, and jets and on boats coming to Britain.
Well, that is absolutely disingenuous, because, of course, the terrorists that who have come from all over the world, I mean, there's people from all sorts of countries fighting inside Syria, and they've been infiltrated in via Jordan and Turkey by MI6, CIA, MIT. And, of course, if these people then go back to Britain or Europe and carry out terrorist attacks, the presumption has got to be to any reasonable person that this is all being orchestrated. Not only have we tried to overthrow the government of Syria, causing untold misery for the people in that country, but it's quite possible that attacks in Brussels and the 7/7 and so on were carried out by our intelligence services as well. And of course, all this relates to 9/11.
That's a big accusation.
It's a big accusation, but we make it every week.
Forget 9/11 for a minute. Let's look at the 7/7 attacks, the Brussels attacks, Paris attacks, Nice, for example. Can you just give me some examples why you think that may not have been carried out by Islamists, by people within the Western intelligence?
The point is that an Islamist may be made the patsy and may even actually plant the bomb. But the question is, who's the infrastructure behind that? Now, what we know...
Can I have some solid evidence from the...
Well, just one basic thing. At Nice, the local police had CCTV footage of this guy who wasn't an Islamist. He was actually a bit of a drunkard and a ne'er-do-well, killing supposedly 80 people with a truck. And then the DGSC suggested that the CCTV footage of that should be wiped, so that there'd be no evidence of what actually happened. Why would they want to do something like that?
At Nice, it was also interesting to see that the FBI were over in France for weeks and weeks, really shepherding and following around the guy that carried out the Nice attack. So their fingerprints were all over it.
Yep. So in other words, and if we go back, you said don't mention 9/11, but the fact is that was one of the biggest attacks ever. And I'm afraid the evidence shows that it was an inside job, as is believed by General Ivashov, who was in command of the Russian armed forces on the day.
For the 7/7 London bombings, that's obviously the biggest attack here in Britain, 50-odd people being killed in that. And one of the things that I was quite shocked and surprised at is that you've got Benjamin Netanyahu here at the Israeli embassy announcing an hour and a half before the bomb attacks that they were going to go on to a special lockdown because they'd had a warning. Now, I thought it was a surprise attack, and how come the Israeli embassy were warned of it?
Well, indeed, you may well ask. How come there were Mossad agents filming the first plane hitting the World Trade Center, who were then arrested subsequently and said, oh, well, we were just documenting the so-called surprise attack?
You know, to look at someone like Netanyahu, he was himself part of the Israeli special forces, wasn't he? He was what you might call a terrorist himself.
Well, indeed, and don't forget that the State of Israel was set up through carrying out terrorist attacks like the attack on the King David Hotel, which killed mostly civilian workers who were working for the British, Arab civilian workers. Terrorism is part of the DNA of the Israeli state and of the British state and of the US state.
I mean, from a journalistic point of view, what absolutely disgusts me is the way that many of these bomb attacks around the world, terrorist attacks of one sort or another, are simply reported through, you'll get maybe Associated Press, Reuters or whatever, wire copy, which is given to them by the authorities, and that just circulates around the world as truth without any real possibility of questioning by journalists.
Well, what we've got to do is have an understanding of history. The head of the Italian Supreme Court, Imposimato, wrote a book that came out in 2012, La Repubblica dei Stragi Impuni, the Republic of the Unpunished Massacres, which he pointed the finger, after decades of investigation by independent police officers in Italy, the finger pointed firmly at NATO, and that includes MI6, for all of those people killed.
So do you think Alex Younger, Europol and the EU, who are talking to all our interior ministers today, are announcing that this may be some kind of quietly announcing this is some sort of Gladio C campaign, taking Gladio on from the Eastern European countries, Azerbaijan, countries to the east of Russia as well, and bringing it right here to home in Europe?
Indeed, and I think we can expect such attacks to take place, but when they do take place, we're going to be asking questions. And the obvious question we're going to ask is, these Islamists that have supposedly come from Syria, maybe they originated in Chechnya, maybe they originated in Turkey, but were they originally recruited by your intelligence services to fight Assad? And were they still working for your intelligence services when these attacks were carried out? Some of them are just patsies, they don't realise they're being manipulated, and they're the ones who end up dead. Some of them are deeply implicated. That's why you need independent police
investigation. One of the things that Sibel Edmonds says is that we're almost trapped into this ISIS story now, and it's a simple story, and it's repeated again and again and again, a bit like Hitler's big lie. So let's have a listen to her finally, a note of sanity to the proceedings on ISIS.
I can speak for the people here in the United States. First of all, for them it's easy to digest, and most people here have been systematically stripped off of their critical thinking ability. They just want some sound bites from the mainstream media. They want sound bites from their TV news. I mean, it's really blurry, the difference between fiction-based sitcoms and what you watch on these types of news with, let's say, CBS or NBC. Mm-hmm. It's very, very blurry, and they work hand in hand, and they accept it. And then we have to admit, they have created, especially since 9/11, an entire industry, from intelligence complex to military-industrial complex. As I said, contractors, subcontractors. You are looking at domestically, at least here in the United States, in trillions of dollars. And then if you start going outward and internationally in terms of gaining dominance in the region, and whether it's with Iraq and Syria and the Middle East, or what's going to come, and it has been at work in Central Asia. Ukraine kind of quieted down, but we actually got what we wanted to get out of that. Next, we are going to see, and that's my prediction, we are going to see some unrest in Georgia, because there are going to be these so-called terror events that are going to be blamed on some ferocious Chechen faction that may be collaborating with ISIS faction, and that's going to lead to Georgia's becoming formally, officially accepted into NATO as a member. We already have troops in Georgia. It's already on its way.
Sibel Edmonds there, former FBI translator, now turned whistleblower. But Martin, with the concentration of the media, mainstream media, into fewer and fewer hands, actually mind-bending becomes easier and easier.
It does, and that's where your fake news comes from, including fake news about fake news. But the internet still exists, and radio shows like this do exist. And increasingly, by looking at the history, and it is historical fact, by looking at historical facts, we can get people to understand the basic structure of what goes on. There is no doubt in the minds of objective historians that NATO is involved in terrorism in Gladio A and Gladio B. So if there's a Gladio C, we pretty much know where to look to put the blame.
Okay. Also, this is kind of mind-bending. It's well worth, I think, looking back at people like Aldous Huxley. He was predicting this kind of thing, the way that society could so easily be manipulated.
Indeed, and I suspect you have a clip which is going to
I certainly do. He called it a kind of technocracy, a kind of scientific dictatorship, far less in your face than George Orwell's 1984.
I would like briefly to compare the parable of Brave New World with another parable which was put forth more recently in George Orwell's book 1984. Orwell wrote his book between 45 and 48, at the time when the Stalinist terror regime was still in full swing, and just after the collapse of the Hitlerian terror regime. And his book, which I admire greatly, it's a book of very great talent and extraordinary ingenuity, is, so to say, a projection into the future of the immediate past, of what for him was the immediate past, and the immediate present. It was a projection into the future of a society where control was exercised wholly by terrorism and violent attacks upon the mind body of individuals. Whereas my own book, which was written in 1932, when there was only a mild dictatorship in the form of Mussolini in existence, was not overshadowed by the idea of terrorism. I was therefore free in a way which Orwell was not free, to think about these other methods of control, these non-violent methods. And I'm inclined to think that the scientific dictatorships of the future, and I think there are going to be scientific dictatorships in many parts of the world, will be probably a good deal nearer to the Brave New World pattern than to the 1984 pattern. They will be a good deal nearer, not because of any humanitarian qualms in the scientific dictators, but simply because the Brave New World pattern is probably a good deal more efficient than the other. That if you can get people to consent to the state of affairs in which they are living, the state of servitude, the state of having their differences ironed out and being made amenable to mass production methods on the social level, if you can do this, then you are likely to have a much more stable and much more lasting society, a much more easily controllable society than you would if you were relying wholly on clubs and firing squads and concentration camps.
Interesting. Maybe, Martin, what's happening is it's going from a Brave New World style thing here in Britain and in Europe. Obviously, this has been happening in other parts of the world long before this, over to a more 1984, more overt kind of thing.
don't forget that both books are books of fiction, and reality is stranger than either of them. We've now got a terror state. We've already got a terror state which uses mind manipulation methods of a Brave New World kind to control the fallout from its own terrorism.
OK, that's all for this week, folks. Time to sign off for the Murdoch News at 7. Coming up, Arabian Nights with Mohammed Makari. Thanks to our guest in the first hour. That's Gary Hopkins from the Lib Dems. Also to Old Labour Oxford economist Martin Summers. Our show page for your comments is thisweek.org.uk. Dialects on Tuesday at noon. And you can get the podcast from dialectradio1word.co.uk. I'm on Twitter at Tony Gosling, wishing you a relaxing and enjoyable weekend. Please join us on the Politics Show at the same time next week. God bless, folks. Don't let the banksters get you down.
From the Sky News Centre at 7, an independent report says over 1,000 Russian athletes benefited from a state-sponsored doping cover-up at the Olympic and Paralympic Games. It includes London 2012 medalists. Callum Leslie reports.
The message was pretty clear.
The Russian Olympic team corrupted the London Games on an unprecedented scale.
Professor Richard McLaren's report found the country's secret police using salt and coffee to tamper with doping samples. Sochi 2014 and the 2013 World Athletics Championships are also affected. World Anti